Повинен бути звук. No, it's because without microphone, but I have to make this microphone like Rick said. And now, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Oh, phew. I'm so sorry. Не запрацював мікрофон зараз? Ви мене чуєте чи ні? Привіт. О, привіт! Ігоре, привіт! Я намагалася робити мікрофончик. Дуже чути, дуже сильно чути, дуже гучно. Чи треба прибрати? Is it from microphone or it's from the phone? Is it sound different than it was with the phone? Мені здається, це з телефону звук. Ну я не знаю, як зробити звідси. But do you remember the sound in the past? Because do you hear the кондиціонер? Як буде кондиціонер? It means that it's from phone, not from microphone. You didn't hear me here, yeah? It's like from phone sound. I don't know how to make it. I need Rick. problem is that Rick asked me to use this microphone. Не працює. Я знаю, що чути добре, але Рік казав, що не добре чути, що треба з мікрофону робити стрім. Може він зайде і тоді допоможе це робити. Слава Україні! І рада була вас бачити, ваше повідомлення. Та ні, все працює. Не знаю. Тут є рек, але воно не вмикається. Я нажимаю, воно ніяк не вмикається. Може тут обидва треба вмикати? Тепер воно буде. Хіл, hello. Героям слава. Тепер воно блимає. Рік, привіт! Stopping by for seconds before sleep. Have a great stream and see you tomorrow. Have a great stream. Ой, thank you so much, Рік. Я не можу вімкнути цей чомусь. Я вімкнула пристрій, але звук з телефону схоже. Bluetooth увімкнений. Чи треба нажимати рек? Я забула. God bless Ukraine. Ні. Ні, не під час стріму, раніше. Але потім не було звуку, не було звуку взагалі ніякого. І тоді я вимкнула, знову спробувала вімкнути. Треба було сьогодні в день спробувати. Я пробувала раніше, в мене виходило. І що робити? Ну да, от така штучка, яка Ярик. Ви мене чуєте? Окей. Ми це зробимо. Sorry, friends, for this disturbing you. Наче до кінця. Ось, її не треба вмикати якось. А, тут написано звука нема. Чому? Отак. Отак. О! А одягати треба от таким чином. Натиснула. Вже звук є. А одягати треба отак. же самое. Що робити? Hello. Окей. I'm so sorry, dear friends. It's not. I'm not lucky today with the sound. Hugs. Okay. Good night. Bye-bye. Bye. Safe night. Hello. It's just Google. Oh, great. Слава Україні! Tonight we will do full moon Indigenous people. I love the late full moon. It's always less stressful for me. Maybe we can hear some documentary thing about Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatar.
Let's be real. Most people over 40
Wait, sorry. It's
use
advertisement.
ChatGPT like it's Google. Copy, paste.
То скільки буде ця реклама тривати?
There are pieces of land that, time and time again, find themselves at the center of events. Places like Sicily, the Levant, and Afghanistan certainly come to mind. But for our story today, we are going to consider the 27,000 square kilometers that make up the Crimean Peninsula. But we're not really going to be talking about the land itself so much as some of the people who live there, who consider it to be their cultural homeland, and who have been dominated and even persecuted for centuries by the various forms of the Russian colonial project. I'm your host, David, and today we are going to be looking at the history of the Crimean Tatars. This is the
Crimean
Cold War.
Tatars.
Maintaining the perfect beard used to be a challenge, which is why I am so thrilled to be partnering with the sponsor of this episode, Manscaped.com, the global men's lifestyle brand that's disrupting the beard market. Manscaped is trusted by more than 10 million men worldwide, so Farsi and Jajul. Plus, for information with the Kipchak Population Pro Kit. Thanks, Manscaped. The history of Crimea stretches back thousands of years, home at various times to the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Goths, the Huns, and the Kipchak. The arrival of the Mongols saw an amalgamation with the Kipchak populations, and after their conversion to Islam, the group that emerged has become known as the Tatars. With the recession of the Mongol Empire, various independent khanates remained, including the Crimean Khanate, which aligned itself to its Turkic Muslim compatriots in the Ottoman Empire across the Black Sea from Crimea. This alignment was more than just cross-cultural, however, as it was also seen as a protection from the growing strength of Russia to the north. As Ottoman power peaked and began to fade, Russian ambition saw a series of wars fought between the two empires as Russia expanded southwards. By 1783, Catherine the Great had conquered Crimea and brought its Tatar inhabitants under Russian rule. Now, the Tatar people who lived there were not a homogeneous group, being broadly divided into two communities: the Nogai, who lived on the steppelands of the north portion of Crimea, and the Tats, who lived in the south of Crimea in the mountains and
Nogai, my father, Tats, my mother.
Along the coast. The common bond between the Tatars in Crimea at the time of the Russian conquest was their shared religion, Hanafi Sunni, as there was no common Tatar language, with over 20 different dialects being spoken across the peninsula. In the Muslim tradition, unused land could be freely brought into use by farmers, while ownership over forests, springs, communal wells, fountains, and wild pastures was prevented, as these belonged to the Ummah, the whole community. With the Russian conquest, Russian landlords and administrators began to move into the peninsula and lay claim to Tatar land. These new landowners came to expect the Tatars to have the same relationship to the land as Russian serfs did, as in being tied to it. This was a situation that did not sit well with the Tatar population. This began a process of migration from the land in Crimea to parts of the Ottoman Empire, seen as their religious brethren. Following the 1792 signature of the Treaty of Jassy between the Ottomans and the Russians, which confirmed Russian hegemony over Crimea, approximately 1/3 of the 300,000 Nogai left Crimea for the Ottoman Empire, often the WWII region of present-day Romania and Bulgaria. This migration was made simpler for many as there was no deep identity attached to the land. At the time, a significant part of the Tatar identity was in their religion, but not necessarily just in its spiritual function, but rather as a cultural touchstone as well. It acted as the moral, judicial, cultural, and societal framework for everyday life. The mullahs held great influence in the community. The arrival of Russian settlers in positions of influence and power, including of the Orthodox Church, was seen as a threat to the place of Islam in the community, and the practice of hijra, the duty to leave territory conquered by non-Muslims in order to preserve the faith, drove some of this migration. This process continued through the first half of the 19th century, with a slow Russification process occurring across what was otherwise a backwater of the Russian Empire. In the early 1850s, however, the peninsula was thrust into the forefront with the outbreak of the Crimean War. The Russians, fearing that the Tatars would collude with their ethnic and religious cousins, the Ottomans, proposed deporting the Tatar population from Crimea, but the plan went nowhere due to a lack of logistical capacity. Instead, Cossack units were deployed to patrol, monitor, and guard the Tatar community. The Cossacks took the opportunity to pillage and loot the people that they had been tasked to protect. This did drive many Tatar to tacitly support the Western Allies, to the point that perhaps as many as 20,000 Tatars were evacuated with the Allies at the end of the war. While the Empire used this as a reason to censure the entire population as being traitors, the assessment from Russians who participated in the war itself was that the accusations were insufficient to censure an entire people. But rumors often have more power than truth, and it was widely believed that the Tatar community was responsible for the Russians' loss of the war. In 1860, the Russian Empire began a military campaign against the Circassians, which involved the forced expulsion of this Muslim population from their homeland in the North Caucasus. This series of actions fueled rumors in Crimea that a similar expulsion was being planned for the Tatars there, sparking a further mass migration to parts of the Ottoman Empire. Estimates show that as many as 300,000 Tatars, mostly Nogai, left in 1860, something that the Russian authorities were initially in no rush to stop. That was until the economic impacts began to show themselves. The lack of laborers meant a significant drop in productivity, which meant a substantial drop in tax revenue for the Russian landowners. There was also a fear that the migration would spread to the Volga Tatar community, devastating the economy in that lucrative region as well. In response, the Russian authorities put a halt on the issuance of travel passports for the Tatar community. The impact of this wave of migration was that in Tarede province, as many as 200,000 of the 300,000 Nogai Tatars had left. This left the Tat community in the south of Crimea as the largest Tatar group. The migration also left the entire Tatar community as a minority in Crimea, outnumbered by the incoming Slavs who were taking over the land left behind by the migrating Tatars. Within 2 years of the migration, Russian language and culture had taken over across the peninsula as the primary mode of interaction. So, at this point, it's important to keep in mind that Tatar cultural identity still centered itself around religion, with the Tatars being part of the wider Dar-es-Islam, the Muslim world. This was instead of identifying themselves as a people from a specific region, with links to specific land. This is what made migration at this point an easier prospect. The concept of nationhood, of a fatherland with its ties to specific territory, did not yet exist within the Tatar community in Crimea. But this was about to begin to change with the emergence of men like Ismail Gasprinsky, also known as Ismail Gasparali. Gasprinsky was the son of a Tatar bey who received his education in Voronezh and in Moscow, and then traveled extensively across Europe, during which he became convinced that the role of conservative Islam in Tatar society was holding back its development. Only by changing the role of Islam among the Tatars could his people modernize and adapt, and therefore no longer be oppressed. Kasprinsky viewed education as a way forward and founded a series of reformist schools teaching more than just the Quran and the Hadiths, and teaching in the Tatar language instead of Arabic. These schools, called the Usul-i Jalad, or New Method, proved to be extremely popular, and they were established across Crimea. Kasprinsky and his movement began a process of consolidating the Tatar language, seeing it as a key factor in building a national identity. It was centered on Orta Turk Tili, or Middle Turkish language. Effectively, this was Oghuz Ottoman, but without much of the Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman grammar. Kasprinsky wanted this standardization to help Crimean Tatars fit better into an emerging pan-Turkic community within the Russian Empire. This was not a political movement, however, and Kasprinsky remained a Russophile, albeit one who wanted the best for his people within the empire. This included speaking out against the migration of Tatars to the Ottoman Empire. It's at this point that we see the emergence of a Crimean Tatar nationhood tied to territory, to a fatherland. This concept, which translates into the Crimean Tatar language as Vatan, itself a borrowed word from the Arabic for homeland, began to emerge. Migration was seen as being against the nation, against their countrymen, against the Vatan. In the early 20th century, the fruits of Kasprinsky's labor began to appear, with calls for land reform becoming more common as the Crimean Tatar community began to become more political as their sense of national identity grew. In 1910, Abdul Rashid Mehdi spoke in the Duma, making reference to the Crimean Tatar nation. The issue of land reform took on greater prominence as Tatars looked to reclaim control over land they were recognizing as part of their heritage. This movement was led by the so-called Young Tatars, similar in spirit to the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire. They continued the work of Kasprinsky, pushing for a greater role for education, and their influence was slowly pushing out the role of the mullahs as community leaders. By the eve of the First World War, in the words of historian Brian Glynn Williams, quote, "The victory of Tatarness over a wider sense of Turkicness had been assured amongst the Crimean Tatar inhabitants. The concept of the Vatan had taken root." Now, the experience of the Crimean Tatars in the First World War was marked by distinction at the front fighting for the empire. Between 40 and 50,000 Crimean Tatars served in the Russian army, including the Crimean Cavalry Regiment. Within these Crimean units, nationalist cells were formed, matching those being formed at home. When the February Revolution occurred in 1917, these cells emerged from the underground and formed the Mili Firka, the nationalist party, making public calls for an independent homeland for the Crimean Tatar people. Unsurprisingly, this was rejected by Petrograd, then the Russian capital, but this only fueled nationalist sentiment among Crimean Tatars. In late 1917, elected representatives from across the Crimean Tatar community elected representatives to form a Kurultai, a council of leaders. There, they elected Numan Çelebi Sihan as mufti of an independent Crimean People's Republic. A constitution was created which enshrined a wide number of protections, including freedom of identity, of speech, of the press, of conscience, of dwelling, of union, of protest, and of life and work. The Constitution also gave women the full right to vote, a rarity anywhere in the world at that time. One of the central policies that Çelebi Sihan began to pursue was a move to reclaim those public lands granted under Islamic practice, the Vakif, the land that had been privatized over the previous century of Russification. The Crimean Cavalry Regiment had returned from the front and was used to maintain order, security, and control over the peninsula. It's important to point out here that the Tatar community in the peninsula at this time was only about 25% of the population, and although there was considerable support in the countryside for the Crimean People's Republic, this was not the situation in the Bolshevik-dominated port of Sevastopol, where the Tatars had little control or support. In January of 1918, approximately 3,000 Bolshevik troops, supported by machine guns, moved out of Sevastopol towards the city of Simferopol, forcing the Tatars in the city to fall back and subsequently be defeated by the superior firepower of the Bolshevik forces. In the wake of the Tatar defeat, Çelebi Sihan was captured and then executed, although likely not with the approval of the Bolshevik leadership in Petrograd. The Bolshevik rampage across the peninsula that followed the Tatar defeat at Simferopol was only stopped when the German army moved forward across southern Ukraine, cutting off Crimea at the Perekop Isthmus. The Bolsheviks retreated southwards, but were captured and subsequently killed. Jafar Sedatmet Kirimer, who had been the Minister of War and Foreign Affairs under Çelebi, returned from a brief exile in Turkey and concluded a military alliance with the Germans in order to defeat the Bolsheviks. Well, this had seemed like an excellent plan to maintain Crimean independence from Russia at the time it was concluded. In the end, the Germans only remained for 5 months. After the German retreat, Crimea became a key battleground of the Russian Civil War. Anton Denikin, the white general named supreme ruler after the fall of Admiral Kolchak, used Crimea as a base to stand off against the Bolsheviks. The whites, representing the imperial order, had no intention of respecting Tatar autonomy and set about persecuting the population for...
Yeah, very interesting, and not like, in Crimea was a lot of changes in this world, I see.
Forcing the Tatars back underground in order to survive politically. The Crimean Tatars, in expectation, or at least hope, of an official recognition of Crimean independence, or at least autonomy, then allied themselves to the Bolsheviks in order to fight against the whites. Bolshevik rule, however, brought no such thing, as the Milifirka was banned and collectivization.
Yeah, it was early bad choice with Bolsheviks.
Agriculture was imposed. As if to add insult to injury, Bela Kun, the same Bela Kun that had bloodily led the Hungarian Soviet Republic for the few months it lasted in 1919, was put in charge of the Cheka in Crimea in 1920. As might be expected, Bela Kun did what he did best and conducted a series of purges across Crimea in which as many as 60,000 people were killed. This was promptly followed by a famine in 1921, whose effects were disproportionately felt by the already impoverished Tatar community. In response to all of this, the Tatar community resumed the guerrilla activity that they had been conducting against the whites since 1918. Lenin dispatched to Crimea Mirsaid Sultan Galiev, a Tatar Bolshevik and future champion of national Bolshevism. Sultan Galiev's investigation into the situation in Crimea in 1921 resulted in a report which called for the creation of an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, an ASSR. ASSRs were administrative units which were created for specific ethnic groups who were normally the titular nation of the ASSR. For example, the Komi ASSR for the Komi people, the Buryat ASSR for the Buryati people, and so on. Based on this report from Sultan Galiev, the Crimean ASSR was created on October 1921. We should point out, however, that unlike most ASSRs, there was no titular ethnic group in the name of the Crimean ASSR. The Tatars were not named. Nevertheless, they did assume, in practice anyway, the lead role in the Crimean ASSR, including most senior leadership positions. This included Veli Ibrahimov, who had been a left-wing member of the Milifirka and had participated in the 1917 Kurultai. He had joined the Bolshevik Party in 1919 and was well-positioned to aid the Bolsheviks as they defeated the whites in Crimea in 1920. Ibrahimov built on the prior work of men like Kasprinsky and Çelebi in building the Crimean Tatar nation as a common and unified group of people with ties to a defined piece of land. So let's explore that a little. Using the early Soviet policy of Goronizatsiya, that's a policy of nativization or indigenization, a topic we explored in an earlier video on the Russification of the Soviet Union, Ibrahimov, as both chairman of the Crimean Central Committee and chairman of the Crimean Council of People's Commissars, rolled out programs designed to build and solidify the identity of the Crimean Tatars. This included universal education in the Tatar language, and not just at the primary or secondary level, but also at targeted university in Simferopol, where classes on Crimean Tatar history, language, and culture were being taught. Archaeological and anthropological research was done across the peninsula, cataloging and exploring its deep and rich history. A Tatar language was finalized called Ortayolak, Middle Road, which was a hybrid of the Nogai and Tat dialects. Books and newspapers were printed in Ortayolak, which combined with its use in teaching, helped to spread and solidify a single common language across the community. Ironically, it's likely that the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union did more to help create and solidify a single Crimean Tatar identity than any other group or individual.
We didn't have this in our history. Like, it's some new vision for me.
For those of you questioning how the promotion of nationalism fit into a communist framework, which was supposed to see national identity fall away in favor of class identity, Lenin identified that the Russian domination of the new Soviet Union left a great possibility of leaving behind non-Russians from the Soviet project. By teaching and promoting communism in local languages, communist cadres could be built in every community across the Soviet Union. For the most part, this promotion of Tatar identity was non-politically nationalist, being deliberately guided towards the promotion of culture and heritage. It did, however, involve severing ties to the religious heritage of the Tatars.
Google. Thank you so much for your help. Take care.
Tatar community. As part of this process, not only were mosques closed, with no functioning mosque in Crimea by 1938, but the alphabet of the Tatar language was changed from Arabic to Latin script, and then finally to Cyrillic. This was...
No, Cyrillic changes. Cyrillic letters destroyed our language. My teacher of Crimean Tatar language said about this.
Done to limit access to the wider Ummah who did not practice Islam in Cyrillic. Now, land distribution, in line with the broader policies of colonization, was also carried out to the benefit of the Tatar community and the concern of the non-Tatar community in Crimea, mostly ethnic Russians and Ukrainians. Keeping in mind that the Tatars made up only approximately 25% of the population, resentment towards the favored status of the Tatars grew. The promotion of so many Tatars into positions with which they had little prior experience, including in industry, could be difficult, and the Tatars were often reliant on the big brother Russians to assist them. This could lead to situations where the Russians looked down on the Tatars as being backwards or uncivilized due to their unfamiliarity with modern industry and administration. Ibrahimov, who believed in both communism and the development of a national identity for the Tatar people, began to develop plans to bring the Crimean Tatar diaspora home. This included an amnesty and then providing funding to assist in the repatriation of the tens to hundreds of thousands of Tatars who had fled to Ottoman lands over the preceding decades. This plan, by the way, wasn't unique to the Crimean Tatar community, as similar plans were developed in both Circassia and in Armenia. Ibrahimov's plan was to resettle these returning people on the steppe of northern Crimea, the ancestral lands of the Nogai who had fled. By this point in the late 1920s, however, Ibrahimov was beginning to run into a challenge. Lenin, the champion of colonization, was dead, and Stalin, no fan of nationalism, was solidifying his authoritarian grip. Ibrahimov's plan to settle the northern steppe ran against Stalin's plan to settle up to 400,000 Jews on that same territory. Ibrahimov, possibly underestimating just what Stalin was capable of, began to preemptively resettle Tat groups from the south of Crimea onto that land, while at the same time underreporting to Moscow the amount of available land on the steppe. The interpretation of the actions in Moscow was that Ibrahimov was not only promoting kulaks, but that he was primarily a nationalist. Ibrahimov was arrested and subsequently executed in May of 1928. The first part of the 1920s was decisive for the Crimean Tatar community. They held, for perhaps the first time, a defined piece of land on which they held ancestral ties, the Vatan, with a shared language and a cultural life. No longer a disparate group of co-religionists, a Tatar nation had emerged, the Koreniy Narod. But as things so often go with Soviet history, this was a high point for the Crimean Tatars, and things were about to get significantly worse. Stalin viewed the nationalist movements like that of the Tatars as an existential threat to the Soviet Union. And to be honest, in hindsight, the collapse of the USSR in 1991 suggested that he was not entirely wrong, as nationalism would serve as one of the key forces that resulted in its collapse. Stalin, recognizing the threat posed by independent nationalist movements, moved to control nationalist feelings and, if necessary, repress any nationalist dissent. After the execution of Ibrahimov, a purge of the Tatar intelligentsia and leadership took place, claiming the lives of approximately 3,500 people. This mini-purge was followed in the 1930s by a wider series of exiles where 30 to 40,000 Crimean Tatars were sent to Siberia in order to facilitate the collectivization process in the ASSR. As you would expect, these actions solidly turned the opinions of the Crimean Tatar community against Moscow. It's important to point out here that this persecution was not guided against the Tatars specifically because they were Tatar, but rather as part of wider efforts at anchoring communist agrarian practice. Tatar culture was still being promoted, and the propiska, the internal passport, still listed Tatar as the community's ethnicity. While the resettlement plans for diasporic Tatars were cancelled, so too was Stalin's idea of the resettlement of the Soviet Jews to Crimea. They got a Jewish homeland in Birobidzhan instead. But the settlement of the Crimean steppe continued, with mostly ethnic Russians and Ukrainians moving to the peninsula, ensuring the Tatars remained a minority in the land they considered their fatherland. The German invasion in the summer of 1941 sparked a series of events which proved disastrous for the Crimean Tatars. To start, in the weeks after the attack, approximately 20,000 Tatars were called up for service in the Red Army, about 10% of the total Tatar population. Many of these soldiers were subsequently captured and made POWs in the disastrous surrenders that befell the Red Army through the summer and fall of 1941. By October, the Nazi war machine had captured and occupied Crimea, not only capturing more prisoners, but giving them a strategic anchor in the Black Sea. Importantly, Berlin was hoping to court the support of Turkey to enter the war on the side of the Axis. So when influential members of the Tatar diaspora in Turkey convinced Ankara to approach the Germans, asking for the release of Tatar POWs, Berlin was willing to listen. These POWs, facing near certain death in the subhuman conditions of the camps, and likely feeling little love with the Soviet Union, were enrolled into Wehrmacht labor battalions. While they were technically volunteers, the choice they faced was between...
He didn't say about, he didn't say a lot of facts. For example, he didn't say about how Russian killed all Crimean Tatars sinkers. He said it was not about Crimean Tatar nation, but it was exactly against Crimean Tatar nation, because they killed all our thinkers, architectures, historian, politician people. It was a red terror in 17 April 1938. Stalin killed us, and I know what he is. He will say that we betrayed, and that's why Stalin deported us. I'm not agree with him.
Between the near certain death of remaining a POW or the chance to live serving in a Nazi labor battalion. In Crimea itself, another complicated situation existed. The invading Germans, initially at least, seemed to be treating the Tatar community on kinder terms than the Soviet authorities had been in the 1930s. And when combined with the favorable memories the Tatars had of the German army in 1918, many welcomed the Nazis as liberators from the hated Soviet Union. Some Tatars signed up to serve in police battalions to help maintain security in the face of growing partisan movement fighting the occupation. Now, this support was not at all universal, and the second largest ethnic group represented amongst Soviet partisan groups in Crimea were the Tatars. Support for the Germans then evaporated as Tatars were forcibly deported to the west to work as Ostarbeiters in the German war economy. As more and more Tatars joined Soviet partisan movements, the Germans retaliated, further fueling anti-German feelings and creating a negative feedback loop. The German occupation lasted until May 1944, when Red Army advances in Ukraine cut off the Germans on the peninsula who were using Sebastopol to evacuate west. In a bloody assault that claimed the lives of thousands, the Red Army attacked and liberated the city from German control, declaring the German occupation over on May 12th. The estimated 20,000 active Tatar collaborators had already been evacuated with the retreating Axis. While this was occurring, the fate of the Crimean Tatars was being sealed in Moscow. Despite some local defense of the Tatar community stressing their role in the partisan movement, most of the calls were for some form of revenge against them. On May 10th, Beria sent Stalin a telegram calling for the permanent exile of the Crimean Tatars for collective punishment for collaboration with the enemy. There are strong suggestions that the decision to deport the Tatars at the top level was less about revenge and more about the Soviets positioning themselves for future actions against Turkey. With Turkey's long history as a traditional enemy of Russia, its pro-German-ish leaning during the war, and its close cultural ties to certain ethnic groups within the Soviet Empire, Stalin viewed Turkey with suspicion. There was also a tentative plan for the potential future conquest of Turkey, and Crimea's key strategic position made its security of vital importance. Deportations of other ethnic groups in the Soviet South had already begun, including the Volga Germans, the Karachay, the Kalmyks, the Chechen, the Ingush, and the Balkar. Now was the turn of the Crimean Tatars. On May 18, a day known to the Tatar people as Karagun, the Dark Day, NKVD troops across Crimea moved against the population. Given less than an hour to collect any personal belongings, they were forcibly moved to rail stations where, over the course of the 2 weeks that followed, they were transported via sealed cattle cars from their homes eastward and into exile. Between 187,000 and 191,000 Crimean Tatars were deported, with 151,604 being sent to Uzbekistan, 8,597 to the Urgut and Mari ASSRs, approximately 10,000 people going to Molotov Oblast, Alperm Oblast, and 11,000 men being sent to work in the coal mines of Moscow and Tula Oblasts. Estimates indicate that as many as 8,000 people died while in transit. Now, we should...
8,000 people died? 46% died of our people. 8,000 people died. It's together with first years in the camps.
To break down some of the demographics as to who these so-called traitors being deported actually were. Of the 151,529 people deported to Uzbekistan, 68,287 were children, 55,684 were women, and 27,558 were men, mostly elderly or invalids. It was...
If Crimean Tatars were collaborants, so why it was only women, men, and children and old men?
Only after the war ended and the Red Army began to demobilize that most of the Tatar men, tens of thousands of whom served as soldiers during the war, were branded as traitors and subsequently deported to the east as they removed their uniforms. Upon arriving in these special settlements, the Tatars were greeted with degrees of open hostility, especially in Uzbekistan, where the new arrivals were not greeted as ethnic and religious cousins, as Moscow had assumed, but instead as a threat to the supply of scarce resources in the underdeveloped eastern stretches of the Uzbek SSR. By most accounts, it took several years for the populations to soften their attitudes and begin to accept the Tatars into the local communities. The Tatar special settlements were most often former barracks or even just mud huts, and they were under guard by NKVD, NVD, KGB troops. As traitors to the state, they were denied any rights as Soviet citizens. They were forced to work in factories or on farms, often adjacent to their living quarters, and they were tied to those jobs and residences, unable to leave. Their ethnicity prevented them from being able to gain any necessary propiska to live anywhere else. Living conditions in Central Asia were radically different from Crimea, drier but much harsher, especially in the winter, with different nutrition available. In the years following the deportation, many Tatars, especially the elderly and the young, died from the tough climatic conditions, including exposure to disease. A census conducted within the Tatar community indicated that up to 46% of the Crimean Tatar nation had died as a result of the deportations and the resettlement process. Revisions by outside parties to the census data have brought that number down to a more likely figure of about 30%, but it is not uncommon, even today, to hear the 46% number being referred to, as it quickly took root as given fact in the narrative told of the Sugulik, the exile. This continued after the Great Patriotic War, and then Stalin died. With the rise of Khrushchev to power and the subsequent thaw that accompanied the process of de-Stalinization, many of the ethnic groups who had been sent into permanent exile were rehabilitated and allowed to return to their ancestral homelands. However, three groups were not afforded this privilege: the Volga Germans, the Meskhetian Turks, and the Crimean Tatars. The reasoning behind these three exceptions is not clearly defined. However, the most likely factor was that the homelands of each of these three groups had become quite prosperous, either from rich agricultural yields or, as in Crimea, as a tourist and holiday playground for the Soviet state. There was no desire to have hundreds of thousands of returnees disrupting that prosperity. So, what was happening in Crimea after the expulsion? Well, the Soviet authorities set about a systematic and comprehensive process of de-Tatarization. Tatar language publications like school textbooks were burned, mosques and cemeteries were either physically destroyed or repurposed for other uses, and villages and topographical names were changed. For example, Akhmeset became Chernomorsky, Bahaschersai became Pushkinsky, and Karasu Bazar became Belogorsk, and so on. The population of deported Tatars was quickly replaced by ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, who often moved directly into the unoccupied Tatar homes, assuming possession of the goods the Tatars had been forced to leave behind. It's estimated that as much as 90% of the Slavic population of Crimea moved to the peninsula in the period after the Tatar deportation. In 1945, the Crimean ASSR was formally downgraded to be an oblast of the RSFSR. In 1954, as we looked at in a previous episode of the Cold War, the oblast was transferred by Khrushchev to be under the administrative control of the Ukraine SSR. It was in this period that the peninsula began to be transformed into a resort area, accessible as a vacation destination for Soviet citizens from across the Union. Domestically, for those who asked, the Tatar community was described as both primitive and as having no ties to the land. Internationally, at least in the West, few had even heard of the Crimean Tatars, and fewer still of the permanent exile that they had been sent into. The first public confirmations of the events of 1944 took until the mid-1960s to leak out, and even then, no real details were available until after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. For the Tatars in exile, however, there was a deep desire to maintain their identity and the memory of the Vatan, the fatherland. While it had been expected by the Soviet authorities that the Tatars would be assimilated into Uzbek society, given the common ancestral links between the two groups, this just didn't happen. The Tatars, generally more Russified than the Uzbeks, were able to maintain their own separate identities, and statistically, they were one of the most insular groups in the Soviet Union when it came to marriages, with an endogamy rate of almost 91%. The Soviet authorities, especially by the time of the thaw, did allow enough cultural freedom to let the Tatar language survive, although they would not allow the right of return to the Tatars. Culturally, the family unit was the main point of transference, with the common narratives of trauma and loss playing a central role alongside the narrative of the
Because begin to be a lot of Crimean houses in the Europe, and also a lot of historian works like German historian I know 100%. American historian too. So now it's more open information. So in the beginning of full-scale war, I could not find such information in English. Really, it's begin only now to be. So in general, yeah, he is right, but not in everything. Thank you, Wenzel.
The eventual return to the Vatan. For those interested in how these narratives manifested themselves, the work of the poet Lilia Bucherova is an excellent place to begin that journey.
Bucherova.
By the mid-1960s, with the Tatars now largely settled in their places of exile, a return to the homeland movement began to take shape, a movement that helped to solidify and give direction to the Tatar community, who was spread out across a wide geographic area. This dissident group, originally established in 1957, has the distinction of being one of the longest operating dissident groups in Soviet history, lasting until 1989. Like all Soviet dissident movements, activists were suppressed by the regime in Moscow, including sentences to the prison system. In 1966, during the 23rd Party Congress, a petition signed by 120,000 Crimean Tatars was delivered asking for rehabilitation and repatriation. 2 months later, at the behest of Andropov, the KGB chairman, the Crimean Tatars were officially rehabilitated. They were absolved of the accusation of mass betrayal to the Rodina, and they were given much wider rights. What they were not given, however, was the right to repatriation. The decree described them not as Crimean Tatars, with its implication of a territorial homeland, but rather as Tatars formerly living in Crimea. They remained forbidden to return to the peninsula. Nationalist sentiment continued and increased, with public protests even occurring. A 1960 rally held in the Uzbek town of Chirchik in celebration of Lenin's birthday quickly transformed itself into a rally for Tatar nationalism and rights. While this may seem like an odd transition, Lenin was seen in a very positive way by the Tatar community because of his support and implementation of Kolonizatsiya in the 1920s. As the celebration changed into a nationalist rally, NVD troops moved in and over 300 people were arrested. This incident was among the first news of the Crimean Tatars to leak to the West, bringing them to the attention of, well, some people anyway. Now, despite the ban, some Tatars attempted to return to Crimea through illegal means, but these attempts were often quickly thwarted, either through the ability of the authorities to strictly control transit into the peninsula by virtue of its geography, or through the means of the propiska, making access to living quarters, employment, and services next to impossible. Arrest and expulsions were the likely outcome, and degrees of violence surrounding many of these, including some deaths. Most famous of these was the 1978 self-immolation of Musa Mahmud, a Crimean Tatar who had managed to return to the peninsula and even buy a house. But because he could not obtain formal recognition of this, he was arrested and sentenced to 2 years of labor. When he was released early, he continued to be harassed by local authorities, and when threatened to be arrested again, poured gasoline on himself and lit himself on fire. He died several days later and was quoted as saying, "Someone had to do this." Most protests and the arrests that followed were used by the Tatar nationalist movement as a platform to preach their message. Most prominent among the dissidents was Mustafa Dzhemiliev, who joined with other prominent Soviet dissidents, including Andrei Sakharov, to form the Initiative Group for the Defense of Human Rights in the USSR. Dzhemiliev used the trials following his multiple arrests as a way of spreading information about the cause of the Tatar people and their desire for repatriation. Moscow, for the most part, had few solutions to provide beyond the use of punitive measures. There was an attempt in the early 1980s to create a new set of homelands for the Tatars within the Uzbek SSR, which would carve out a new autonomous region to be named the Mubarak Republic in the underdeveloped rayons of Kashgardaria. There, education and services would be provided in the Tatar language, and Tatars would be given priority for the hiring of new positions to staff the region.
This offer was rejected by the Tatar community, however, for two main reasons. First, they had no interest in stripping the Uzbeks who already lived in the region of their land, but second, and most importantly, they viewed it as a betrayal of the desire to return to their home, the Vatan. By the mid-1980s, thousands of Tatars were leaving Uzbekistan and the east and moving back towards Crimea, but not to Crimea itself. They were instead relocating to regions like Kherson and Krasnodar. Not allowed to return to the Vatan itself, they were moving as close as possible, still hoping for an eventual return. This was followed by some limited and highly controlled resettlement of some Tatars to the steppe of northern Crimea, but few follow-up plans existed to expand this movement. By 1989, however, the situation across the Soviet Union was changing radically. The reform measures enacted by Gorbachev had not only fomented strong national sentiments across the country, but also a more honest reckoning with some of the past injustices in Soviet history. Included in this was acknowledging what had been done to the Crimean Tatars. On November 24, 1989, a front-page article in both Izvestia and Pravda called the 1944 deportation of the Crimean Tatars a barbaric act on the part of the Stalinist regime. It also stated that the USSR Supreme Soviet considers it necessary to take the relevant legislative steps for the unconditional restoration of the rights of all Soviet citizens subjected to the persecution. The way was then paved with the return of over 500,000 Crimean Tatars to their promised land. In the spring of 1987, there were 17,400 Tatars registered as living in Crimea, but this number quickly began to increase after the right of return was granted. By June of 1991, it numbered 135,000 and 173,000 by May of 1992. By the end of 1993, it was 259,000. But the return to the Vatan proved to be difficult for many. While plans were underway in the Soviet Union to help with the transition, plans like the construction of infrastructure for agriculture and industry, as well as the provision of state services, this all ground to a halt with the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. Most of the Tatar community, although they had a heritage of living in villages and working in agriculture, had become urbanized, used to factory jobs and living in cities. The land, the houses, the possessions they had been forced to abandon in 1944 remained, but was now owned by others. The Tatars, as they returned, established themselves where they could, often on marginal land where they have since established whole communities. In some cases, public land, which had belonged to the Tatars in the past, has also been seized, leading to armed standoffs. To magnify challenges, much of the land they were returning to was in poor condition, suffering from environmental degradation and damage after years of Soviet mismanagement. The collapse of the Soviet Union saw Crimea become a legally recognized part of Ukraine, although there were efforts by KGB and GRU agents to make a deal with Tatar leaders as they returned to support the transfer of Crimea to Russia. These offers were rejected in favor of overtures from Kiev, who promised further support in their resettlement efforts for the Tatar returnees. This support, however, largely evaporated after the 1995 removal of Yuri Meshkov's pro-Russian governance of the short-lived Republic of Crimea. Like for so many in East and Central Europe, the 1990s was a difficult period of transition. While Crimea did become a confirmed part of Ukraine, up to 80,000 Tatars who were living in Crimea were initially denied Ukrainian citizenship as they had relocated after the collapse of the USSR. Without citizenship, they were denied access to rights as citizens, as well as the scarce services that existed. This took until 1999 to be fully resolved, with citizenship finally being granted. Other related migration issues included no state-level agreement being reached between Ukraine and Russia, leaving up to 30,000 Tatars inside the borders of the Russian Federation with a more complicated path necessary if they choose to move to Crimea. Socially, the returned Tatars encountered xenophobia and discrimination from the majority Slav population, although this was slowly being addressed by the government in Kiev and Simferopol in the first decade of the 21st century. The illegal Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 has been strongly opposed by the Crimean Tatars, who fear the effects of repressive authoritarian rule by Moscow. In the years since the annexation, Crimean Tatars have seen the Mejlis, the executive body and traditional structure of the Crimean Tatar community, declared an extremist organization and banned. Russia has reportedly refused to renew the registration for mosques used by Crimean Tatar communities, and Crimean Tatar leaders have been harassed, arrested, and otherwise persecuted by Russian authorities. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Crimean Tatars have borne the brunt of mass arrests, searches, and raids in both Crimea and the occupied territories of Ukraine. These have been justified by Russian authorities by accusations of extremism or terrorism. The history of the Crimean Tatar community is one of hope, of persecution, of progress, and of crushing setbacks, but all defined by their desire to maintain their cultural unity. It's also a story of empire and of colonialism. Since the emergence of a unique and defined Crimean Tatar identity in the second half of the 19th century, the Crimean Tatars have fought, struggled, and died to preserve their culture and their heritage in the face of the seemingly ever-present threat posed by St. Petersburg and then Moscow. But even when forcibly removed from their land, they maintained a persistent desire to return, no matter how difficult the struggle proved to be. Even after their return, the challenges and obstacles they have faced have been monumental, with only greater hurdles put in their way. There's been a great deal of discourse in recent years regarding the possible decolonization of Russia, and the Crimean Tatars are firmly at the leading edge of this movement after centuries of colonial domination. The research and the writing of this episode has been both emotionally difficult, but also highly rewarding for me personally, and I can only hope that the spirit, perseverance, and determination of the Crimean Tatar people to simply live their lives in peace will continue to shine in these dark days. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, making a clarion call for a brighter, independent future for all bell buttons scattered around the world, yearning to go home. Please.
I use my phone. I make stream from my phone. Crimean War full documentary is interesting.
Прошу кожного долучитись або поширити цей збір. Дорогі українці, звертаюсь до вас за допомогою. Наша мета – це відкат для виконання завдання на сході України. Саме це захистити небо. Нам потрібна мобільність, ефективність та надійність. Ми, підрозділ Збройних сил України, протиповітряної оборони. Буду вдячний кожному за маленький крок на перемогу. Слава ЗСУ, слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Спробуй новинку Моршинська зі смаком полуниці і переверни своє уявлення про воду.
If you haven't heard already, the Armchair Historian team is working on a free historical strategy game Fire and Maneuver. It's a PC game set between the years 1853 to 1871, meaning players can take command in conflicts like the Franco-Prussian War and even the Crimean War. You can follow development using our Discord link below, and you can play the game early by supporting us on Patreon. Learn more about Fire and Maneuver by checking out our Steam page below, and don't forget to wishlist. As a fierce battle rages around them, the Light Brigade of the British Cavalry is preparing to charge. Though their orders were vague at best, shouted over the din of gun and cannon fire, the men are ready to ride forth. But unfortunately, for these brave soldiers, their charge will not be wholly remembered as a noble and triumphant action. Instead, it will go down in history as a monument to the chaos and foolishness of the Crimean War. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. In today's video, we will be re-examining a topic which we covered in one of the first ever videos on this channel, the Crimean War. One of the largest and bloodiest European conflicts in the 19th century, the war is remembered primarily for the disastrous incompetence of the commanders on both sides and the ultimate futility of the conflict. But while the immediate consequences were insignificant, the long-term effects of this conflict altered the course of European history and set in motion events that would one day lead to the First World War. Ever since its foundation in the early 1700s, Imperial Russia had sought control over the warm water ports on the Black Sea, an area traditionally under the influence of the Ottoman Empire. Although once considered the menace of all Christian Europe, by the 19th century, the Ottomans were in a rapid decline. A decline which Russia was eager to exploit. But after the tumultuous shakeup of the Napoleonic Wars,
my work is easy because I use ClickView. Here's how I keep track of all my tasks. I start my brain
under the influence of the
Flandersfield, hello. Gurun Singh.
Ottoman Empire. Although once considered the menace of all Christian Europe, by the 19th century, the Ottomans were in a rapid decline. A decline which Russia was eager to exploit. But after the tumultuous shakeup of the Napoleonic Wars, most other great powers of Europe desperately wanted to avoid any more disruptions to the balance of power, creating tension between them and the expansionist Russians. This tension finally boiled over in 1853, sparked by, of all things, a dispute over the rights of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. In an effort to project power in the Middle East, France declared itself the protector of all Christians in the Holy Land and convinced the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul-Majid I, to issue a decree that the Catholic Church had sole authority over all churches, holy sites, and Christian citizens in Palestine. This irritated the Eastern Orthodox Church in Russia, which had previously held control over most of these churches. Of course, neither France nor Russia really cared about the religious rights of Christians.
Very, I think, I forgot this word, primitive, I think, maybe I'm not right, primitive. Today I slept only 1.5 hours in general. Примитивно.
Primitively.
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 Primitively. It's a little bit primitively. Because he used, for example, old names of the states, like Russia, and used their flags.
Christians in Palestine, controlling churches meant projecting
And
power
called
and influence in the
Palestine.
Middle East, a strategic goal of both nations. The French emperor had challenged Russia to a game of chicken, and the Ottoman Empire was unlucky enough to find itself right in the middle of it. Not one.
No, because of the work. Because I did a great big art before in the night. I was slept very late, and I stand up from my volunteers work, activist work, and then I have the concert, and then I have the stream. Didn't eat a lot today, didn't sleep, but and I also have the rehearsal work, like first meeting with regisseur of documentary set, where maybe we will do documentary set, documentary performance with this amazing great woman. Palestine is not like Ukraine. Sorry, but this is comparison is
Comparison.
this comparison is absolutely not right. I don't want to touch this stem, but sorry, no.
To back down, the Russian Tsar Nicholas I promptly sent.
We never attacked Russia in our history of independence. We never do the war, and we never said that Russians have no rights for existence. We never do it. We never unite another countries against Russia. So, no. We are not like Palestine.
An ambassador to the Ottomans in hope of changing the Sultan's mind. This effort succeeded, and the Sultan promptly restored authority over the churches to the Orthodox Church in Russia. Expectedly, the highly ambitious French Emperor Napoleon III escalated the situation by sending a warship into the Black Sea as a show of force, which prompted Abdul-Majid to flip-flop once again and proclaim his eternal respect for the authority of the Catholic Church. Further negotiations proved fruitless, with the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire stepping in to support the Sultan against Russian retaliation. Neither side was willing to back down, and so in May of 1853, two Russian armies crossed the Prut River and invaded the Balkan provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Left with no other choice, the Ottomans declared war in response and set forces to check the Russian advance at the Danube River. Arriving in September, the Ottoman Empire quickly moved to establish strongholds along the Danube under the leadership of the skilled general Omar Pasha. The first battle of the war took place in early November, when the Ottomans crossed the river and recaptured the occupied town of Oltenica in modern-day Romania. The Russians launched a counterattack to reclaim the town, resulting in a bloody and indecisive battle, which ended with both sides withdrawing to their previous positions. Fighting in the Balkans would continue in much the same way for the rest of 1853, with neither side managing to gain a decisive advantage. Tsar Nicholas was hoping for an announcement of support from Austria, his long-term ally, in order to break this stalemate. But the Austrians were reluctant to get involved. Instead, they hoped to settle things with the mighty pen and hosted a conference in Vienna with representatives from France, Britain, and Prussia, with the goal of drafting a treaty to end the war. While these talks were ongoing, Russian warships chanced upon an Ottoman fleet near the port of Sinop. Hoping to disrupt their enemy's supply lines, the Russian ships opened fire, initiating battle. This engagement saw the first ever use of explosive shells in naval combat, which completely devastated the wooden hulls of the Ottoman ships, inflicting over 3,000 casualties and destroying their entire fleet. The events at Sinop alarmed the other great powers, and the representatives at Vienna quickly finalized a proposed peace treaty, which they presented to Sultan Abdul Majid and Tsar Nicholas in December. Nicholas was willing to accept the terms offered, but the Sultan objected, and diplomatic talks soon completely broke down. Fighting continued, and in February of 1854, Britain and France presented an ultimatum to Russia: withdraw from the Balkans, or they would join the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
But now, Russia refused to back down,
Like
and the British and French...
real Palestinians and the great patriots said it's free from Hamas, free for terrorists that didn't give them opportunity for good life.
declared their own war in March of 1854. Having made no further gains, and fearing the intervention of a dubiously neutral Austria, Nicholas ordered his forces to withdraw from the Balkan provinces in July. Russia at this time was one of Austria's most important allies, and so by not supporting the Russians, they found themselves isolated diplomatically all throughout the 19th century. With hostilities temporarily ceased, the war could have ended there. But Britain and France, spurred on by pro-war public opinion...
You know, exactly from this time, in this time I really, you know, before in my childhood, students, I could not imagine how people could create concentration camps for Jewish people. How another nation could be alright with this, could watch this and say, okay, if they will not touch us, they kill Jewish people. And now I really realize how it worked, how Hitler was so popular, how Hitler created with this absolutely anti-Semitic vision, created this concentration camp and killed millions of Jewish people. And it's scary, it's really scary, and I hope that these words never again will be always never again. And really it's great luck that we have a lot of people with wisdom that could understand and could see more.
And eager to put an end to further Russian expansion, chose to continue the fighting, launching a full invasion of the Crimean Peninsula. Seizing this peninsula would cripple Russia's naval power in the Black Sea, greatly reducing their influence in the Middle East and Balkans. The Allied forces landed at a beach north of the city of Sevastopol in September, and their troubles began almost immediately. The landing of the invasion force was badly mismanaged. For starters, there was no equipment for the unloading of cargo, forcing the soldiers to steal carts and wagons from nearby Tatar farms. During this piecemeal unloading process, the soldiers were forced to sleep outside.
I lost line of history. I'm so sorry. I need to watch about Crimean War. In Ukrainian. Holodomor. Maybe we bought Holodomor. Let's
Do you think this?
let's watch something about Crimean Tatars. Something more. Maybe we will find something interesting. Crimean Tatar. He's a 1 year ago he did this. Tatar nations other Crimea. No, when Tatars ruled Ukraine. Oh? I don't know what is the history. Crimean Tatars in 5-minute guide. Okay.
Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, and long before Russia began creating historical myths to justify its occupation, Crimea was home to a people known as the Crimean Tatars. You might be wondering, where are the Crimean Tatars today? In Crimea, of course. It's their home. Despite centuries of colonization, marginalization, discrimination, deportation, and today occupation, the Crimean Tatars are, against all odds, still in Crimea. It's an incredible story which we should all pay more attention to because Russia's centuries-long effort to eradicate the Crimean Tatar people continues to this day. Here's the story. The Crimean Tatars have lived in Crimea for a very long time, 1,000-ish years roughly, and in 1441 founded their own state, known as the Crimean Khanate. They speak a Turkic language, are a mostly Muslim people, and despite the name Tatar, they aren't closely related to the Volga Tatar people in the southern Ural Mountains. In the 1770s, Catherine the Great sent Russian settlers into the Crimean Khanate, which infuriated
like
the
the
locals,
sound.
but eventually gave the Russian Empire the excuse to invade and annex Crimea in 1783. From that moment on, Russia's successive regimes have followed a similar pattern. Force Crimea to become more and more Russian, and then use that Russianness as an excuse to occupy it. According to a 1785 census, when Russia first colonized Crimea, Crimean Tatars made up 84% of the population, while Russians made up just 2%. For most of the century, Russians remained a small immigrant minority on the peninsula. But by the late 1800s, the Russian and Crimean Tatar populations were roughly equal. This is partly because a lot more Russians had arrived by then, but also because Crimean Tatars were repeatedly forced to leave in huge numbers. During the chaos that followed the 1917 Russian Revolution, the people of Crimea declared independence, creating the Crimean People's Republic. Its government was multi-ethnic, and it had a legislature known as the Kurultai. It didn't last long, however. Bolshevik forces captured Crimea less than 2 months later. Life for Crimean Tatars under Soviet rule was brutal. Between 1917 and 1933, an estimated 150,000 Crimean Tatars, roughly half the total population, starved to death or were expelled. This wasn't enough for Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, however, who opted for full-on genocide. In May 1944, right at the height of World War II, Soviet secret police forced roughly 200,000 Crimean Tatars onto cattle trains, relocating them to Uzbekistan, then also part of the Soviet Union. Thousands died during the journey, and thousands more died in the harsh conditions they found on arrival. And of course, their property back in Crimea was confiscated. As with other genocides, the Soviets justified their crimes with racist arguments. Crimean Tatars were accused, as a people, of being traitors, and of collaborating with Russia's enemies. And after the Crimean Tatars were deported, thousands of villages with Crimean Tatar names were given new Russian names to erase all evidence they'd ever existed. It's easy to see how the Crimean Tatar people could have disappeared at this point, but they endured. And in 1989, right before the Soviet Union collapsed, Crimean Tatars were finally allowed to return home, and roughly 277,000 of them, about 12% of the total population, live in Crimea today. Administratively, Crimea has been part of Ukraine since the 1950s, and after Ukraine became independent in 1991, the Crimean Tatar people created a second Kurultai, led by an executive body known as the Mejlis. The Mejlis, led for many years by Mustafa Jamilev, has campaigned for Crimean Tatar rights and fought for restitution of the land that they lost during the 1944 deportation. I think it's fair to say this process was taking longer than Crimean Tatar leaders would have liked, but there has been some progress. Crimean Tatars are engaged in Ukraine's democratic process, and many of the leaders have served as deputies in the Ukrainian parliament. And in 2014, that parliament recognized Crimean Tatars as an indigenous people, and the Kurultai and Mejlis as its representatives. Russia's decision to occupy and annex Crimea again hasn't just been a setback for Crimean Tatars, it has put them squarely in the crosshairs of yet another Russian empire that wants total control of Crimea. The Mejlis, temporarily based in Kyiv, are very clear that they want Russia's occupation to end. Russia has responded by banning the Mejlis as an extremist organization and issuing arrest warrants for its leaders. Life for ordinary Crimean Tatars under Russian occupation has been grim. One of the first acts of the occupation regime is to order Crimean Tatars to vacate the land they had settled in on their return from Uzbekistan. According to Human Rights Watch, they are also subject to harassment, arrests on trumped-up charges, and torture. A group of local lawyers known as Crimean Solidarity has spent the last 8 years defending dozens of Crimean Tatar political prisoners from within Russia's legal system. It's an uphill battle. For the Crimean Tatar people, liberation from Russian occupation cannot come soon enough. How long it will take is hard to know, but there's one thing we do know for sure. Perhaps no other people on Earth have more experience enduring and surviving Russian occupation than the Crimean Tatars.
I'm okay, thank you. Quite interesting. Why Russia is destroying Crimea? Ukrainian in English. Yeah, Ukrainian is
Я
great.
выучил английский в 50 лет благодаря этому методу. You can do.
Stones are so tired, so utterly torn, thinking that the whetstones, sleek and endlessly worn, storm brewing for thousands of years. These stones are so tired, so utterly torn, thinking that their homeland is no longer theirs.
In the middle of the night, there was a loud knock on the door. The soldiers said we had 10 minutes to pack our stuff.
People were scared and confused.
Tears, moans, and screams. And the train took off.
It stopped only in the forest. Sometimes we were stuck there for days, but people were not allowed out. When we arrived in the Urals, people were starving. They were gnawing on tree bark.
These testimonies of the Crimean Tatars bear witness to the greatest tragedy that befell their people in May of 1944, the deportation. They stand as evidence of Moscow's attempts to mentally and physically destroy at least 200,000 indigenous Crimeans who were forcibly relocated to remote areas of the Soviet Union, so they would dissolve, disappear, and never be able to answer the question of who Crimea truly belongs to. For decades, this crime of Soviet authorities was silenced, remaining unpunished. And even today, few know that this atrocity was planned by the Russians, over the course of centuries. However, let's take it one step at a time. The year is 1768. The Crimean Khanate, as the state of the Crimean Tatars was known at the time, began a war with the Russian Empire in alliance with the Ottoman Empire. Russian troops entered the peninsula and stayed even after the peace treaty is signed. Now, the peninsula was important to St. Petersburg in economic, geopolitical, military, and psychological terms as a symbol of the empire's expansion. Just a few years later, Russia provoked an uprising against the Crimean ruler, Khan Shahin Garai, whom the Russians themselves had installed in power against the will of the Crimean people. Under the pretext of suppressing this uprising, Russia sent additional troops. And then it immediately announced that the Crimean Peninsula, Taman, and the entire Kuban side were accepted into the Russian Empire. This is how the occupation began for the Crimean Tatars, a period known as the Black Century. But the Crimean Tatars didn't intend to surrender so easily. The peninsula exploded with armed uprisings. The Russians deployed punitive units to repress the rebels and their families. During the first years of the occupation, more than 30,000 Crimean Tatars were killed. However, brute force alone was not enough for the Russification of the indigenous people of Crimea. So Russia resorted to its favorite method of hybrid warfare, rewriting history. Catherine II tasked imperial historians with justifying the occupation of the Crimean Khanate and proving that the Crimean Tatars had no reason to claim special rights. Imperial forgers took on the task of solving this ideological challenge. So, here's the premise. For millennia, the history of many peoples and tribal unions has intertwined in Crimea. All of them laid the foundation for the future nation of the Crimean Tatars. From the mid-15th century, they became the leading ethnographic group on the peninsula. Khan Haji I Garai united the powerful and influential families of the Crimean nobility and established a new independent state, the Crimean Khanate. Russian history forgers took these facts, filtered them through the imperial ideology, and produced a new version of Crimean history. Supposedly, the Crimean Tatars were descendants of Mongols, who arrived on the peninsula in the first half of the 13th century as conquerors. Hence, they could not be considered indigenous. Alongside the propaganda machine, the repressive one operated. Its goal was to create such unbearable conditions for the Crimean Tatars that they would leave their homeland voluntarily. Crimean Tatars, Muslims by faith, faced repression even in their religious life. The occupiers destroyed Muslim temples, and under the direct command of Prince Potemkin, systematically stripped them of their land ownership rights. The Empress ordered each nobleman to settle his serfs on these lands. The goal was to populate the occupied territories with as many Russian subjects as possible. The Crimean Tatars found themselves in the status of landless laborers on their own land. The locals were forbidden from using the forests and required to pay for access to mountain meadows, water, pastures, firewood, and hay. Their homes were forcibly taken from them. This caused several waves of mass immigration of the Crimean Tatars to the neighboring Ottoman Empire, resulting in a major demographic crisis.
Yeah.
A new war between the Russian and Ottoman empires gave them hope for the revival of their statehood. However, the hostilities were sluggish and ended with the peace treaty, under which the northern Black Sea region, including Crimea, remained part of the Russian Empire. The occupying state further increased pressure on the Crimean Tatars to finally drive them from their land. The Russian Minister of Internal Affairs, Count Kochubey, ordered to give exit passports to the Crimean Tatars en masse. The threat of forced deportation loomed over them. However, the disaster was averted by Governor General Duke Richelieu, who arrived in Crimea from Odessa. He halted the deportation not out of empathy for the Crimean Tatars, but for practical reasons. The indigenous population had centuries of experience farming on this arid land. Without them, Crimea would have become a wasteland. Richelieu submitted a report to the Russian administration and by the following year, passport issuance to Crimean Tatars had been suspended. Likewise, repressions on the Crimean Tatars increased. The occupiers levied exorbitant taxes. All books and manuscripts were confiscated from libraries, mosques, educational institutions, private collections, and homes, declared to be banned literature, and burned. Crimean arts and crafts.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Power blaster, I don't think so. Don't trust Putin. And Putin will stop the war only if Ukraine absolutely lose, like we could not find, or if he will really in bad position. But now he's in a not bad position. Absolutely, he will continue to do his war. So he had opportunity to occupy it more. Why he would stop the war? And Ukraine will never say okay for this. So we have a lot of irony about this, especially Trump's deadlines, many different deadlines for peaceful agreement. We are just Ellie.
Were also destroyed. Architectural monuments were ruined, and cities and large settlements were renamed. All of this increased tensions. The Russians began to fear an armed rebellion, and with the outbreak of the Crimean War, they were concerned about the Crimean Tatars siding with their enemies' allied forces. For the second time, the Russian authorities prepared a plan to deport Crimeans to distant provinces of the empire. The only obstacle was that the Allied army landed in Yevpatoria. Crimean Tatars suddenly found themselves at the center of life-changing events for their homeland. In February 1855, Crimean Tatar militia groups took part in the battles near Yevpatoria, harassing Russian troops.
I think we will have again war in Yevpatoria because it's high.
Eventually, the Russian Empire lost the war for dominance in the Middle East and the Balkans. Under the terms of the peace treaty, Russia was prohibited from maintaining a navy in the Black Sea. Unfortunately for the Crimean Tatars, however, Crimea itself remained part of the Russian Empire. The Crimean Tatars once again left their homeland in large numbers. This massive wave of emigration continued until the early 20th century. This century, in turn, created new challenges: the revolution and civil war in the Russian Empire, the rise of the Bolsheviks, the formation of the USSR. This new government, however, did not consider the interests of the new Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The short period of national revival was followed by Stalin's repressions in 1937, when most of the Crimean Tatar intelligentsia, anyone who could interfere with the plans of the communist government, was physically destroyed. He was already preparing to implement his desired scenario: Crimea without Crimean Tatars. This became possible during the Second World War. The Soviet defense of Crimea was a fiasco. By the autumn of 1941, the peninsula was completely occupied by the Germans, and the Crimean Tatars were accused of the failure. The leaders of the partisan movement in Crimea, Alexei Mokrosov and Serafim Martynov, in an attempt to cover up their mistakes, spread the myth of alleged widespread collaboration between the Crimean Tatars and their Nazi occupiers. Contrary to these myths, during the Second World War, about 16,000 Crimean Tatars served in the Red Army. At least 5 received the title of hero of the Soviet Union, and the pilot Ahmet Khan Sultan, who shot down 30 enemy aircraft, twice became a hero. Despite this, as soon as the peninsula was de-occupied from German troops, a project to evict all Crimean Tatars was submitted to Stalin, quote, in light of their treacherous actions against the Soviet people and due to the undesirability of their continued presence on the Soviet Union's borderlands, end quote. The entire Crimean Tatar nation, from newborns to elderly, was accused of Nazi collaboration. The Crimean Tatars were celebrating their liberation, not knowing what would happen to them in just a week and what crime was being prepared against them. In preparation for the deportation, between 25,000 and 32,000 members of the NKVD, the Soviet Union's secret police force, were sent to the peninsula.
On the evening of 17th of May 1944, many trucks arrived in Simferopol. At the same time, a lot of soldiers appeared in the streets. We little boys were running around the streets, petting them until we lost track. Could we have imagined what they were there for?
Именем советской власти за измену Родине вы выселяетесь в другие районы Советского Союза.
I woke up and saw an officer angrily reading something on paper to my mother. 2 soldiers were standing in front of her. They were in a hurry and said we had 10 minutes to pack.
People were driven to a cemetery surrounded by machine guns on all sides. Children were taken away from their parents and told that the elderly would be shot and that children would be sent to orphanages. They were held separately for about 3 hours. During this time, some others were driven to madness.
The trucks arrived, and we were taken to the outskirts of the city, to the railway station. Tears, moans, screams, and the train set off. When we crossed the Crimean border, everyone in the train was singing. They were singing and crying.
My mother told me it took us at least 3 weeks to get to the Urals. The train stopped only in the forest. Sometimes we would be stationary for several days, but people were not allowed out of the wagons. By the time we arrived in the Urals, people were starving. They were gnawing on tree bark. When they found out that potatoes had been planted there last year, they went searching for them. Last year's frozen potatoes.
These are just some of the memories of the Crimean Tatars who were deported from Crimea and uprooted from the land they had been intertwined with for centuries. The operation was completed by 4 p.m. on the 20th of May, when 67 trains packed with Crimean Tatars
I mean that when the Crimean War began, it was in Evpatoria, Kislev, and when we will liberate, it will be always also hard. It will be also battlefield because it's position, because it's direction of this city.
were sent eastward to Central Asia and the Ural Mountains. Anyone who dared to resist was shot. Gravely ill persons, or as they were referred to at the time, non-transportables, were also shot. On the way to the trains, NKVD soldiers mixed up the families so that relatives and neighbors would not be put in the same wagon. The wagons, once used for livestock and prisoners of war, had floors strewn with straw mixed with horse manure. Their roofs were scorching under the blazing May sun. Each wagon held up to 200 people. They died of stress, suffocation, unsanitary conditions, and lack of water. The dead lay mixed with the living. At best, the bodies were hastily buried along the railway tracks. At worst, soldiers simply threw them out of the wagons. After weeks of travel, the Crimean Tatars, accused of betraying their homeland, were brought to their destinations and given uninhabitable dwellings. Damp dugouts, sheds, or barracks. They were forced into grueling labor, working in Uzbekistan's cotton fields or felling trees in the Ural forests. Under threat of death, no one was allowed to leave the place of exile. The exact number of victims of deportation from Crimea remains unknown. According to the self-census conducted by the National Movement of Crimean Tatars, in 1944 at least 200,000 Crimean Tatars were deported. However, researchers insist that the real figure could be twice as high. As a result of this special operation, more than 46% of the Crimean Tatars died during the eviction and years of exile. Crimea went orphaned. It was thrown to the mercy of the looters. Trophy items seized by the Soviet soldiers were sent by post to the Russian hinterland. Crimea went orphaned. Its historical monuments were demolished. Crimean Tatar schools, museums, and scientific institutes were closed, and more than 1,500 libraries and entire cemeteries were destroyed. The Soviets used the tombstones from the Crimean cemeteries in the new construction of houses, sheds, fences, and sidewalks. Crimea went orphaned. In place of those who had cared for it, thousands of ethnic Russians arrived, benefiting from the alienation of tens of thousands of Crimean Tatar homes and properties. But instead of restoring Crimea, the settlers kept destroying it. They destroyed the natural and cultural landscape and used perennial fruit trees and vineyards as firewood. The situation was even worse with the traditional Crimean Tatar water supply system. The Russians did not know how to maintain and clean it. Of the hundreds of small fountains in towns and villages, only a few survived, while ancient wells and springs in the foothills and mountains were left clogged. Very quickly, Crimea began to turn into a waterless desert. The authorities faced a serious issue of urgently addressing the situation, which threatened both an economic and environmental disaster. Thus, it was decided to build the North Crimean Canal and invite Ukrainian peasants from the southern regions who were skilled in cultivating fertile black soil. This was one of the main reasons why Crimea was transferred to the jurisdiction of Kyiv in 1954. Meanwhile, the Crimean Tatars persistently demanded the restoration of their rights, hoping to return to their homeland. However, most of them were only able to do so after the collapse of the Soviet Union. As soon as this happened, the Second National Congress, the Kurultai, began its work in Simferopol. It adopted the Declaration of National Sovereignty of the Crimean Tatar people and elected its government, the Mejlis. It was then that the Crimean Tatars decided to be part of an independent Ukraine. Unfortunately, a little more than 20 years later, the imperial tyrant once again stretched its hands to Crimea. In 2014, Russia occupied it once again. The centuries-old repressive machine was immediately activated, and the ruthless uprooting of Crimean Tatar identity began again. All NGOs, media, and religious associations were obliged to re-register under Russian law. The activities of those who refused were suspended. The Crimean Tatar language was once again being pushed out of the education system and public life. The Mejlis, the highest representative body of the Crimean Tatar people, was declared extremist and banned. Those residents who refused the concept of Russian Crimea had two options. The first was to leave. During the several years of occupation, between 60,000 and 100,000 residents left Crimea. with at least 30,000 of them being Crimean Tatars. The second option was to stay and fight. So 80 years after the deportation, uninvited guests came to the homes of the Crimean Tatars again, with searches, abductions, arrests, and terror. In 2016, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, in its resolution, stated that the repression of Crimean Tatars by the Russian authorities posed a threat to the very existence of this people. Since the outbreak of full-scale war on the 24th of February 2022, repression and terror in Crimea have only intensified. One of the most insidious methods of repressive policy towards Crimean Tatars was the so-called partial mobilization. In the first days of the full-scale war alone, more than 1,500 Crimean Tatars received draft notices from the occupying administration, which grossly violates the Geneva Convention and constitutes a war crime. This triggered a new wave of Crimean Tatars leaving the territory of the peninsula once again. With the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, the peninsula, which had endured the deportation of its indigenous population, ironically became a staging ground for further deportations of Ukrainians. In the 21st century, they are forced to go through filtration camps, interrogations, and torture. Their documents are taken away, and they are forced to change their citizenship. Every day, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars scattered across the world eagerly grasp at news from home, especially from Crimea. They know that the liberation of the peninsula will be the key to the liberation of all of Ukraine, the country where there will be no place for intolerance, where every nation will thrive in its own uniqueness. Each believes that the moment will come when the occupiers will finally leave the Ukrainian lands, but not those who call it homeland.
Bir kun biz yurtqa jumlamiz qaytajaqmiz. Siz xatirlarsiz, mejbur olacaksınız. Ne yerlerden siz kelib chiqqansiz? Nasıl, munda davetsiz buyurgansız? Qaytgan vaqtda jumlamiz qaytajaqmiz. Çölde, dağlarda şen bayram yapacaqmiz. Sizin fermanlar, tayaqlar, hukumuna biz çalgı ve oyunla yo'qqa devorarmiz. Xalqini butunlay jazoga uchratmak sizga navbatli bir shen o'yinchoq. Qaytgan kunimiz to'prog'im sez berirsin, ruhlar, tanrılar bir yerga keltirirsin. Uzoq bu yo'lni bir umid bilan kechganmiz. Avdet olmoqni bir menzil deb aytganmiz. So'nggi daqiqagacha minadik biz. Bir kun qaytajaqmiz yurtqa. Hepimiz.
I will read for you this novel.
Qaytgan vaqtda jumlamiz
Ukrainian lands, but not those who call it homeland.
bir kun biz
when we all return to the land of our birth, you will have to remember the place of our wars. You'll have to recall where your own roots reside. For here there is no shadow in which you can hide. When we return, and return we shall do, in mountains or steppe we will gather in you, holding a funeral with music and cheer, to bury your loves and your battles of fear. Your grandchildren's dream, cruel and grim, that nation can perish to serve. When we return, our land will rejoice. Its spirits will rise to echo of our voice. We carry their love through the darkest of days. Not all endurance through the contrast delays. But even the fallen belief will come home together beneath the skies no longer. The poem was written in Crimean language. This aggressor will not stand. Yeah, absolutely. I just draw my own art, and this dream helps me so much to calm down. I guess I'm a bit stressed sometimes. No, my problem, so sleep is not my best friend. It's good that it can help you a little. It was writing, on the screen. What time is it? Oh, I need to go sleep. It's very late. Yeah, war help to understand why other problems cannot be. Absolutely great summit. Yeah, my dear friends, it was an International Indigenous Day, and I created the art about full moon. This is a full moon in general. Full moon indigenous people. Добраніч, Power Blaster, Munch, Northern Chimp, Dennis, everybody who are with me, El May, thank you so much, Martin, Tofu, everybody who are now with me, good night and see you next time. If you like this stream, you can share it with your friends, Write the comments, big comments, your thoughts about Crimea, your supporting to the Crimea, and if you like it, you can support me, and you can find all the links that you need. Thank you so much, and see you next time. It would be on, I think on Wednesday. Oh, it would be tomorrow by week. Героям слава. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.